Why was Sarah crying on her wedding day? For most, it's a day of joy, but for her, it felt like a life sentence. The man waiting at the altar wasn't a husband, he was a nightmare. Zachary, cold and ruthless, a gangster feared by all. And now, he was about to claim her as his bride, whether she wanted it or not. This is how her story began. Sarah walked slowly down the altar, her heart heavy with a pain she could barely understand. Dressed in a beautiful wedding gown, she glanced at the smiling faces around her. Everyone seemed happy, but not her. The tears in her eyes were hidden by her veil, but the sadness in her heart was undeniable. The man she was about to marry, Zachary, was the city's nightmare. A ruthless gangster with no compassion. Sarah hated him with everything inside her, but there was nothing she could do. She had been forced into this marriage by her own mother. Her mother had sold her to Zachary after borrowing a large sum of money from his family. When she couldn't repay the debt, she handed Sarah over as payment. Sarah could never forgive her mother for this betrayal. It was a moment that shattered her trust, leaving her with nothing but hate. She glanced at her mother, who smiled at her like everything was fine. It only deepened the pain in Sarah's heart. How could her mother pretend to be proud of her on the day she was selling her to a man she feared? Sarah wanted to scream, but she held it all in. She couldn't speak the truth to anyone. Not even her best friend, who had been led to believe that this marriage was her choice. The guilt weighed heavily on her as she stood at the altar, facing the men who had threatened her just the day before. Sarah missed her father, who had always protected her. But now, he was gone, leaving her to face this nightmare alone. If only he were here to speak up for her. She looked up at Zachary, who stood there with a smug expression. He had set rules for her. Rules she couldn't refuse without dire consequences. She could feel the power he held over her, and it made her feel small and helpless. The ceremony went by in a blur. The priest's voice echoed in her ears, but it all felt distant. When it was her turn to speak, she wanted to say no, but the fear of what would happen if she did kept her silent. Instead, she whispered the words, "I do," even though she didn't mean them. The crowd cheered, but Sarah's heart sank. Zachary had no love for her. His kiss was cold and fake, and his words even colder. He mocked her, calling her a whore, and told her she had much to answer for. Sarah felt sick. She was no longer a bride but a possession, and she knew it. After the ceremony, Zachary led her to the dance floor. He touched her like she was nothing more than a body to use. He whispered in her ear, telling her to meet him later, and Sarah knew what that meant. Her body, her virginity, everything she had saved for someone who truly cared, was about to be taken by him. The thought made her stomach turn, but she had no choice. She tried to find some comfort in her mother's words, telling her she had a rich husband to be proud of. But Sarah was beyond caring. She wished her mother would just marry him and leave her be. The anger and resentment built up inside her, but she kept it all in, walking away from the wedding venue, ready to face her new life as Zachary's possession. The drive to his house felt endless, but the reality was clear. This marriage was never about love. It was about control. And now, she was trapped. What happens when the life you've dreamed of turns into a nightmare? How do you survive when every step forward feels like walking deeper into a trap? After the nightmare of her wedding, Sarah's new reality began. The car ride to Zachary's mansion felt endless, each passing moment a reminder of the life she had lost. Now, standing before the imposing house she would call home, Sarah could only wonder, would she ever escape this prison? The weight of the wedding gown felt like an overwhelming burden as Sarah stepped out of the car. Sarah's thoughts raced as she looked up at the imposing house that she would now call home. The facade of the place was almost as suffocating as the reality of what she was about to face. A maid greeted Sarah and led her up to her new room. The door creaked open, and Sarah found herself stepping into a pink-themed room, a color she had always loved. But today, it did nothing to ease the weight in her chest. Sarah collapsed onto the bed, a deep sigh escaping her as she reflected on her situation. Sarah was now trapped in a house with someone she barely knew, someone whose presence terrified her. Thankfully, at least they were not to share a room. A knock at the door shattered Sarah's thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be Zachary? But it wasn't. Another maid stood there, informing Sarah that her husband, Sir Zachary, wanted to see her downstairs. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her anxiety almost overwhelming, before gathering herself and heading to the bathroom to wash away the exhaustion of the day. Sarah's thoughts clouded as she entered the closet and saw the clothes laid out for her, short, revealing gowns that made her feel exposed. Realization hit. These were meant for Sarah to wear at all times. With a sigh, Sarah chose one, dressed quickly, and locked the door behind her as she descended the stairs. Sarah couldn't find him in the sitting room, but the tension in the house was thick. Sarah hated the feeling of unease that crept in with every step she took. As Sarah entered the dining room, she finally saw him. Zachary. His presence was chilling. Sarah's stomach tightened as she sat down to eat, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. After finishing her meal, Sarah stood to leave, but his words stopped her. "You look beautiful in that dress," he said, his gaze making Sarah feel small and exposed. Sarah's heart raced. She was barely holding it together. "Thank you," Sarah muttered, trying to leave, but he stopped her again, his words sharp and commanding. He told Sarah to remove her gown. The room felt colder as Sarah stared at him, stunned. She hesitated but knew there would be consequences if she didn't comply. His demand to undress was a blow to Sarah's sense of dignity. She slowly, reluctantly removed the gown, her hands trembling as she stood before him. The silence was heavy, filled with a tension Sarah couldn't escape. Sarah covered herself, but the tears started to fall, each drop a reminder of her helplessness. His command for Sarah to touch herself left her numb. The emotional pain was almost unbearable. Sarah wanted to scream, to fight back, but she knew she was too far gone. Time seemed to drag as Sarah obeyed his cruel demand, tears blurring her vision. Each moment was a blow to Sarah's spirit. He watched without a hint of compassion, his smirk never fading as he continued to command her. His coldness made Sarah question if she was still the same person she had been before all this. Eventually, he told Sarah to come to him. Sarah's body shook as she obeyed, each step a struggle. Sarah's hands trembled as she undressed him, her mind a whirlwind of hatred and disbelief. What had Sarah become? But despite everything, Sarah complied. The pain was overwhelming, both physical and emotional. Sarah had lost everything that day, her sense of self, her dignity, and the dreams she once held. This man, Zachary, had taken it all, and there was nothing left but the bitter reality of her situation. A few hours later, Sarah woke up feeling hurt and broken. Last night's sex was painful to her and it weighed on her, but deep inside, anger began to grow, even if she didn't fully understand it. At the same time, Zachary walked through his world with confidence, controlling everything around him. While Sarah struggled, he didn't see the quiet storm that might rise against him. Zachary arrives at his warehouse, full of confidence and authority. He steps out of his car, adjusts his glasses, and lights a cigarette. Smoke curls around him as he walks into the building. Inside, faint music plays while workers and guards bow their heads as he passes. Zachary doesn't stop or look at anyone, heading straight for the chambers. Inside the chambers, his colleagues are already waiting. He looks around and quickly notices Mason isn't there. A colleague reports a business deal from Chief Dini, but Zachary dismisses it angrily, calling it too small for someone of his status. His voice carries power, leaving no one to question him. Not long after, Mason arrives. Though late, Zachary values Mason's hard work and quickly gets to the point. He spreads out a map and explains the details of their next mission. The team must enter a heavily guarded mansion, sneak in quietly through the back door, and retrieve an important document hidden in a closet. Zachary stresses that the job must be done without any mistakes or violence. After the briefing, he dismisses the group but asks Mason to stay for a private chat. The two share a light moment, but Zachary's distant attitude about his personal life remains clear. At the same time, Sarah wakes up feeling sore and humiliated. To her shock, she finds herself lying naked on the dining table. Anger burns inside her as she thinks about how Zachary left her there after their encounter. She quickly gathers her clothes and goes upstairs to her room, furious at him for treating her this way. In her room, she takes a bath to clean up and ease the pain in her body. Afterward, she takes some painkillers and dresses in fresh clothes. Just as she tries to relax, there's a knock on the door. A maid introduces herself as Vida, her personal attendant. Vida hands her a pill, saying it's from Zachary and meant to prevent pregnancy. Sarah's anger explodes. She refuses to take the pill, ordering Vida to throw it away. Before Vida can leave, Zachary suddenly appears at the door. His commanding presence fills the room, and Sarah confronts him, demanding answers.
If you're enjoying the story, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts.
Sarah's attempt to stand her ground crumbles as Zachary enters the room. His tall figure towers over her, filling the space with an air of authority and fear. He orders Vida to leave the pills on the table and walk out. Then, with a cold and threatening tone, he warns Sarah about what happens to those who disobey him. His words are chilling, hinting at the cruel fates of others before her. Scared and defeated, Sarah takes the pills and swallows them, her heart sinking as he watches her every move. He pats her shoulder like a master pleased with his pet before leaving the room without an ounce of regret. Sarah sits there, anger burning inside her. The men who had hurt her so deeply showed no sign of guilt or care. Trying to calm herself, Sarah calls for Vida to bring her a cold drink. The strawberry yogurt helps her relax for a moment. But soon, an older woman walks into the room carrying a tray of food. Curious, Sarah asks who she is. The woman introduces herself as Mrs. Dara, the head maid who has worked in the house for over 20 years. Their conversation reveals shocking truths. Mrs. Dara tells Sarah that she is the 12th woman Zachary has brought into his home. The others either left in despair or were killed when they tried to escape. This revelation leaves Sarah shaken. But what shocks her even more is when Mrs. Dara says that Sarah is the first woman Zachary has ever married. This marriage, she implies, is not just about money, it's something deeper. Sarah presses further, trying to understand, but Mrs. Dara suggests that her mother might have wronged Zachary in a way that goes beyond the $350 debt. Confused and desperate for answers, Sarah calls her mother. The conversation quickly turns bitter. Sarah accuses her mother of lying about the debt. Her mother's response is harsh and uncaring. She refuses to explain herself and even blames Sarah for her situation. Then, in a moment of cruel finality, she disowns Sarah, cutting all ties with her. The call ends, leaving Sarah broken and in tears. She screams in frustration and throws her phone against the wall. Vida rushes in to check on her, but Sarah is too overwhelmed with pain and betrayal to speak. Sarah's cries echoed through the night, her heart heavy with betrayal. Her mother had abandoned her, and Zachary's cruelty only deepened her pain. Anger burned within her as she vowed not to let them break her. But as the storm in her heart grew, she wondered, how much more could she take? Sarah is consumed by anger and betrayal as she demands to know where the man she once called her husband, Zachary, has gone. Her frustration builds as she reflects on everything that's gone wrong in her life. She storms into his room, where she finds him working on his laptop, and unleashes her fury. She accuses him of being a beast, but he responds coldly, followed by a violent slap that sends tears streaming down her face. In the heat of the moment, Sarah strikes back, calling him a pig, but her words are only met with more cruelty. Her emotions escalate as she confronts Zachary, questioning why he married her in the first place if this is how he would treat her. She tells him she disowns him, blaming him for her mother's rejection and all the pain she's endured. Despite her defiant words, Zachary reacts explosively, grabbing her by the throat and lifting her off the ground. Sarah spits in his face in retaliation, but Zachary tosses her to the floor, causing her ankle to break. As Sarah lies there, struggling with pain and humiliation, Zachary orders his guards to drag her away. Although physically broken, Sarah's spirit remains unshaken. She vows that Zachary will regret his actions as the guards take her to the basement, where she is tied to a chair. Zachary enters, his sadistic smile showing his pleasure in her suffering. He orders the guards to restrain her further and prepares for more torment. Sarah's gown is torn as Zachary demands the guards bring wires. She closes her eyes, bracing for the pain, but her spirit refuses to break. The wires lash across her body, and Zachary taunts her, asking if it hurts. Sarah's cries echo, but she remains defiant, refusing to plead for mercy. The torment escalates as Zachary climbs on top of her, forcing himself on her in an act of violence. Despite the brutality, Sarah refuses to submit, her mind races remembering her past and she recalls the warning she had received about her marriage. As Zachary continues to humiliate her, she reflects on the life she once had, a life that now feels like a distant memory. In the final act of defiance, Sarah refuses to beg for mercy when Zachary demands it. He tries to break her with more threats, but she stands firm, her spirit unyielding. He slides her cheek with a knife, the blood flowing as he demands she plead for her life. Sarah, however, refuses to submit. With a faint smile, she tells him she would rather die than bow to a monster like him. In the end, Sarah passes out, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of enduring Zachary's cruelty. She fainted. She chooses death over submission, knowing that her dignity is the one thing he cannot take from.